everybody, welcome back. It's Christine again with the Artist Pod, and today we'll be talking about how to draw an earthworm. As always, I'm using a Wacom Intuos Pro tablet, and I'm drawing straight into Photoshop. So, let's get arting. Alright, so here is the earthworm. Pretty straightforward, so it shouldn't be too hard. I'm not going to do what I usually do, where I sketch it in first. I won't really need to. All the lines are going to be basically going the same way. So, just going to get started. No need to shorten out the lines. There's still going to be a chance to add some detail, which will be good. I'm going to take a lighter color and see how that works, where I take the lighter color and stripe him. That should add a lot of good detail here, but otherwise just, these long strokes. And I'm going to fill it in a little bit more than usual. I'm going to go ahead and basically do the shadows as we do this, following the contour of the worm. And I've already decided my light source. I'm going to mention that now because I may start adding shadows and highlights. My light source is going to be coming from above and to the right, which means it's above and in front of. And we can talk about, especially on a figure like this, where it's sort of wrapped around itself, how the shadows would play out as a result. Right, so just filling it in. After this sort of shadow layer that we're doing now, I will need to take the sketch off just so that I can see the edges. That's the problem with the sketches, it's a little harder to kind of get the feel for where the edges are. And just, not putting full pen pressure here. I'm actually still being very light. Not as light as I typically am when I'm doing shadow, because there's going to be some depth of color difference with him. And yeah, otherwise it's pretty straightforward, because we're just following that contour. These lines are just going to go down the length of the worm's body. There's going to be some angles that are a little bit more difficult, as we do it, as we go. I could turn, and I think I've talked about this before, I could turn my canvas, but I don't like doing that in Photoshop for some reason, because I'm ridiculous. And usually right now I do a sketching step. It's because I don't have to really worry about the direction the lines are going, that I'm not really doing that, and I'm jumping kind of straight into doing this sort of shadow. So I won't have to add shadows later. They'll already be here. I will have to add highlights, however. On a, you're not looking at a lot of space to work with a worm. It's sort of long and narrow, so I likely would have had to do this even if I'd done the sketching step where I do the whole thing in shadow to sort out the highlights. So this will sort of save a step. And like always, when I'm bringing this edge in, I'm swooping my lines in, right? Like I'm bringing them down like this, so that I'm angling that in so that the edge stays a little straighter. And because there's no fur, there's no real need to temper off how long my strokes are. Tempering it off when I get to different sections, but not because I need to be mindful of how long fur is going, but more because I need more control. So I'll shorten it out in those cases. So for instance, as I come down here, sometimes it won't draw. Shortening that out because I'm coming to another delineation, right? Earthworms have that little, I don't know what it's called, thing that is on them randomly. And so getting to the edge there, that will be an edge that is then picked back up, by the drawing and then coming to another edge where his body actually blocks it, right? And even though all the lines are going the same way, the fact that we've stopped the lines, you can see the edge. So it doesn't matter that the lines are still going the same way. The act of stopping that line creates a little bit of a shadow which delineates a space. And again, yep, just not full pin pressure here. Longer strokes will sometimes be a little heavier handed. It's the nature of how we draw, right? Like when I'm making a longer stroke, I'm usually drawing a little heavier, but I'm not, I'm being conscious of trying to pull back, and I'm being conscious of not putting pin pressure. So even if, you know, it ends up a little brighter because my strokes are longer and inevitably that means I'm pressing harder, it should still have a lighter look than once I put full pin pressure. And, you know, anytime you have the chance to add more details, the better, right? Like a worm, great, but we have a chance to add a lot of details even though it's a worm, right? Even though it's just this long sort of noodle. With snakes, I typically do that by drawing the individual scales, which is actually a really hard thing to do and takes a ton of time. With a worm, I'm gonna see how it works to add in you know, a little bit of lighter color going across its body for its little humps. That should add a nice little burst of detail, which will be nice. Because you want, it's sometimes the little details that really can make or break a subject or a drawing. And even if a drawing would be fine without them, sometimes adding in those details can really make it pop in a way that, you know, maybe didn't realize it could. On like big cats and things, that's as simple as adding in whiskers and drawing those in, and that can make a big difference. So I always look for ways where I can add in these little details, because I've learned over time little details can really flesh out a subject in a way that I don't always anticipate. Right, and bring this up to that edge, which will create the delineation of space, and then, you know, having the edge come down to another edge, although this other edge it's running into will have a change of line direction. And you can see when I do a longer stroke, sometimes my strokes are a little heavier, and the line is a little bit more defined instead of lighter. But if I pop that off, you know, you can clearly see where that line on this is. And I'll probably bridge it a little bit more than it is now. Just, you know, the deeper a shadow, the deeper the bulge or the recess or the valley or the, you know, whatever. And so the lighter the shadow, the less that is. It's not as much. And so this isn't a big hump on a worm. And so I don't want it to be overly noticeable. I mean, I want it to be there. I want it to be noticeable. But the more this is shadowed up here, the bigger this hump will look. And there will be some shadows and highlights from where that part sort of comes over, right? Where this loops over it will cast a shadow. Just fixing some of the edges here. For the most part, it turned out pretty good, but just a few spots that are not connected exactly the right way. And anything too long, I tend to get rid of, right? Like when there's a really long line, don't necessarily want that there. Which is hard to avoid in a situation like this, but I'll just often, you know, fill in part of it. So following that contour, right, so I'm angling it the same way the body of the worm is angled. And often you'll see me come back, pull back and like take this off, or just in general pull back and take a look at it. You know, it can be one thing to be zoomed in and drawing, but sometimes you can miss how something looks as a whole unless you zoom out. And so I'll do that a lot just to get perspective on how it's looking. While it may look fine up close, especially once I start adding the highlights, it may not look fine. You know, far away. I'm changing where I am because this angle is a little bit harder for me to do the loop, so I'm going to change where I'm drawing at the moment. And then I'm just going to make sure these lines are straight. As I bring it down, I might have to erase some. And it's okay to have some wobble in your strokes. As you can see, mine aren't perfectly straight. It'll still work. I mean, I'm trying to keep it, you know, as straight as I can, but I don't really typically, I'm not very good at drawing straight lines. So, you know, this style works very well for that. And even on something like an earthworm where you wouldn't necessarily have, you know, variations in like fur where it's okay that it wobbles, this will still work once shadows and highlights are applied to it. Much like with eyes, it's the same sort of thing. I have trouble with the angle just underneath, but in the end it still works, because what can really make or break an image is the highlights and the shadows. And then again, just always backing out, making sure it's looking good. And as I go, of course, fixing in any of these edges that turned out a little wonky. I'm just making sure that these two edges line up between this side and the little tail. And without that, you know, purple sketch layer in place, I can see better to be able to fill this in the rest of the way without it in. Now that the shadows are in place, you know, as we've already talked about, light source coming from above and to the right, all edges are in shadow, so we're just going to be brightening it up on the side of the light source. And this pen is not working out very nicely right now. I'm recording a lot of my strokes. But side of the light source, and we'll be feathering it in. I am putting a little bit more pin pressure, but because we've already added in the shadows, I don't need to put a ton. And then we'll back it off as we bring it to the edges on both sides. And so you'll notice as I pull back, that center line of where the highlight is a little off center, right? There's a bigger shadow on this back side than on this side. And that will, you know, the orientation will change as the worm, as that direction of the worm changes, right? So as we bring it down, this will still hold true, but as we do this loop, some of that will have to shift. So we're bringing it down. Just that, you know, solid pin pressure, but not as much as usual. Oh, that voice. I've had a lot of pollen lately, and I think it's killing my voice a bit. Flaring up some allergies. Now, something to talk about here is there will be some shadowing from this top guy. The light source coming from above, and in front of the shadowing will be on the back side. But it's possible we won't see much of it. Probably we'll see a little bit that comes over here. So, you know, the further up, if the light source were angled just a little differently, the further up this is, and I just started a new layer to demonstrate it, the different placement of the shadows and the highlights, right? So if this were coming way up and the highlight was on the other side of this, you would have highlights still coming through, and I would match the layer of that, the edge of that, you know, body here, right? And then we'd have another kicking in here where you would have kind of that shadow and a dispersal as such. And so that would shift, you know, the further, the closer to the body this is, right? So if we move it just a little higher, and I took that and erased it out, it'd be, you know, a little closer together, and then so on and so forth. So you can really adjust the shadow quite significantly based on how high or low you want an object to appear. I'm going to get rid of that because that's just that kind of layer. So with it coming from above into the right, highlights hitting here on this side, shadow probably looping down this way because it's going to be a little bit more extreme. So my shadow line is going to be twisting right around here and getting closer as we come this way, but still not touching all the way. In addition, like, we hit where all edges are in shadow, right? So we have this kind of line so that it's looping. This would be pretty close, but it pulls out here because inevitably the body of the worm is rounded, and because the body of the worm is rounded, right, worm is like this, then the shadow is going to taper off in a rounded way. So, you know, anytime I'm adding shadows and highlights, I try to think about how the light would be affecting anything. Same is true when we get to the tail. It'll be in a bigger highlight if it's raised up, or, you know, like it might come down a little bit further, might change how we see it. So it just depends on how you want your subject to look. Now there won't be any shadowing on this side of the tail, right? We come over here and this will be in full highlight because that light source is coming from the right. So this will still be in full highlight, and then we'll have some shadowing on this side because once again you have the body blocking itself. So, you know, just sort of thinking about how that would work and where to put a shadow or a highlight, depending on what your subject's doing. So we're going to pull the highlight all the way down from the top to the body of the worm here. And I am being a little bit more careful on this edge and on this edge. So anytime I'm adding a highlight to an edge of something and I sort of cluster those lines in, sometimes you can see, and you can kind of see it on this one, where I sort of bridge that together, right? Like you can kind of see this line here. Way to fix that is to just brighten up the other areas around it, and it will help blend that in. And now that's a little harder to tell. Now right now obviously it's looking a bit harsh, so we'll be feathering that in you know, as we bring it down and around. Right, so still bringing this around, and as we come underneath, it's going to shift exactly where it is. So, right, the highlight will be closer to this side, even though it was closer to this side. So we'll be shifting that over. See, we're going to just bridge kind of that gap in. Because now this is on that side, and this is now on that back side. So as we shifted it over on the top, we'll be doing the same underneath. Right, where we have that back side now. And then we'll be flopping it again as we come back around to this side. Now I find it easier sometimes, especially in a case like this, right? Like you can see I'm just drawing it in instead of filling in the whole thing in between. Right, so here it's on that back side. And then it flips over to be closer to the right side edge. And then as this comes up, it'll be giving more room for that shadow underneath and on that back side. And then as we bring it down, we'll be flipping it again till it runs in to its body. And then just sort of filling in what I just drew. It's definitely looking a little interesting right now. Right, and then down here, same thing, we've run into an edge, so gonna be careful along the edge. And then fill it in from there. Now the tip will be in shadow because that's aimed away from the light source. And we're going to have some shadowing from the body, and it would follow that line, right? So I'm actually going to have it a little bit further away than that. So to feather it in, it's light pin pressure. Light pin pressure, and I'm just building up the lines and allowing the lines to add the highlight until it looks like, you know, there's no clear line defining highlight and shadow. It's just hard to see an edge. So very light. And pull the shadow over as far as need be to make that happen. But it shouldn't need a lot because it's just light pin pressure. It gives you a ton of control. With the shadow lines we already put into place. And that's just how we blend it in. Pull that shadow over as much as we need it. And you can actually see the difference already in the head here versus the rest of the body, right? Just that little bit. That's all that's needed. Doesn't take much. Just light pin pressure. And feather it over. Until you can't see a clear line for highlight and shadow. It just sort of fades. And I also find pulling back can really help. This is another case where, you know, if you're too close, it can be hard to tell how well you've done that, you know. So I'll pull back, make sure that I'm getting the whole picture instead of just a micro snapshot of it. And so now that head, I guess it is, looks a bit more natural. I'm gonna get just this area up in here. And we'll do that all the way down. That's why it's nice to give some room, some wiggle room to do this, because I don't want to have to push the highlight all the way to the edge because I didn't give myself enough room, right? Or to make the side on the light source have just as much highlight as the side against the light source. So this gives enough room by giving the bulk of the highlight, making it a little short, gives you basically a runway to fade out the color, to fade out the highlight. And again, it's just light pen pressure, making sure that I'm fading it out and that it looks and makes sense. That goal is to have not a clear delineation between highlight and shadow, including up into here, right? I don't want a clear delineation. I want this to fade as well. But I did kind of already fade the tip, so that makes it a little easier to fade it from where it already is. Now sometimes you can have a clear shadow. It does definitely depend on what you're doing and what, you know, what effect you're going for, how harsh your light is, how solid an object is blocking it, you know. On the, you know, actual worm where it's rounding, I would say that would not be true. It is possible that where the worm is blocking itself, you know, that this shadow might be harsher and wouldn't fade as nicely. And again, just always pulling back, making sure the whole thing works, makes sense. Sometimes as I'm fading it out, I do have to come back up in here, right? Like if I fade it out, sometimes it's still a little too harsh on that edge. And so if that happens, you know, you just brighten up that section in and push that highlight fade further out. Basically, I mean, it doesn't take much. It's pretty easy to do. Just making sure you're holding back your pin pressure. That'll give you a ton of control. And constantly pull back, because especially in this step, right, you can get so micro-focused on one area, and you want it to be consistent. And you can kind of see that further back, the whole sort of big picture, right? But it's this fade that we're doing that'll give the worm a rounded appearance. You know, you would treat shadows differently depending on potentially the shape of whatever you're drawing. But this makes it appear round by fading it off nice and gently, as opposed to this makes it look like it has a flat top, right? This section that's not feathered in yet looks like this is a flat top. Ideally that means that this edge should also be in highlight, but it would potentially retain that harsh shadow depending on the shape and angle of the light source. Shape of the object and angle of the light source. But a worm is round, so we don't want it to look flat on top, we want it to look rounded. So now we have a nice round worm. I'm going to taper off this transition just a little bit, and I'm going to do that by just gently adding in more lines. And it's the transition between this part and the rest of the worm up here, so it's not necessarily the shadow transition, but I feel like this is still a little bit too harsh. I'm going to take a lighter color and come across with it in the highlighted sections to segment it. Give it a little bit of a roundness Doesn't have to be anything nice and clean. Just enough to kind of indicate it's got some segmenting to it. We'll be adding even a brighter highlight that'll be not as intense as this one is. Well, I should say, be adding a brighter highlight and using white, so certainly it'll be intense, but it won't be as wide or deep or whatever as these guys are. Not putting a ton of pin pressure, just a little bit. Getting the segments somewhat close together. Angles would change depending on how the worm comes down, right? Changing up that angle a bit. Just brightening them up just a little bit. And see already, look at that difference. It adds some nice detail. Now, I don't think this one has it. I think this is like a solid little bit there. I'm just twisting that angle with the worm. You can see how I'm turning the lines as I follow the worm around. It always goes, you know, sideways to it, perpendicular to it. In effect, what we're doing by doing this is creating an area that's just a little bit more shadowed, because these segments would be brighter, right, because there's dips in between them. So that's what this is and why we're doing it. And now we're going to take the white, because worms are, you know, slimy, and we're going to add more. Just a little bit of white highlight against them, but more in a pinpointed way. Kind of off to the right, so the idea here is that it's wet, and so you would get potentially an extreme highlight, but you would get it in a more pinpointed spot. So this is where the highlight would be the strongest, right? This again, right, it didn't have any of those segments, so, you know, we could probably do just a bigger flash there. And keep going. Just a little bit there. For the most part, all I'm really doing are these little lines, although sometimes I'm doing like a squiggle, right? Going up and down. Although that was not good. But right. Still, for the most part, it's those lines and not the squiggles. I think both will work, though. Just occurred to me. And as, right, it's coming down, we're going to change that angle, just like we had to with where the you know, the highlight and the shadows were. The same is true for this extreme highlight, because it would be again on that bigger angle, so it's going to be shifting from this line to this line, from this outside following all the way around to the inside as it comes up, and then it's going to flop back to that outside here once it gets around. As we come up here, start to shift it again. Till it's back at the top. And then shift it again as it comes back underneath. All right, so I think that added a lot, right? If we take that off, or even, you know, that midsection, I think all of that adds a lot. Even on, you know, a worm, just these little details can do so much. I'm going to fix one section though. Right down in here. Not big, but when I pull back, I feel like I can see it, so I'm just gonna kind of line it up to this area here. Yeah, there's like a weird shape as it turns inward. Sort of gives it a nicer rounded spot. And then up in here, just gonna make sure it looks like there's a weird dark section, and so I'm just gonna give that a little bit more, get it more fleshed out. All right, so that is how you draw an earthworm. I hope that was helpful. In the floating nether next to me, I have other videos of art tutorials I have done, and I will see you all soon. Thank you so much. Take care.